The Dakota Territory winter of 1881 struck with the merciless fury of an ancient god. And Hazel McKenna pressed her numbed fingers against the frosted stagecoach window as the vehicle lurched to a grinding metallic halt. Through the glass, she watched crystalline spirals of snow dance across an endless white expanse that stretched to the horizon like death's own shroud. The cold seeped through every crack in the wooden coach, turning her breath to vapor and making her teeth chatter despite the worn wool shawl clutched around her shoulders. At 21, she had crossed an ocean with nothing but determination and her mother's dying blessing. But now she wondered if hope could survive in such a merciless wasteland. Her fingers found the bent tin locket at her throat, tarnished silver, that had belonged to her mother, containing a scrap of paper with a handwritten recipe for rye bread. The memory of her mother's final words came flooding back with painful clarity. "America will be different, my darling girl," Bridget McKenna had whispered during those fever-racked days in their cottage near Cork, rain drumming on the thatch roof while potato blight blackened the fields beyond their door. "The landlords here care nothing for Irish lives, but in America you'll build something that endures. Promise me you'll go, even when I'm gone." Hazel had knelt beside that narrow bed, holding her mother's work-worn hand, while fever consumed the woman who had scrubbed floors and mended clothes to keep them alive. Outside their cottage, she could hear the English landlord's men setting fire to the homes of families who could no longer pay rent on land their ancestors had worked for generations. "I promise, Ma, I'll make you proud," she had whispered. "You already have love. Now go build that better world for all of us who couldn't." Her mother's eyes had closed for the final time as flames lit the night sky beyond their window. The memory felt as fragile as ice crystals in this frozen hell. Axles snapped clean through. The driver's voice shattered her reverie, rough with cold and mounting panic. "Can't fix her in this weather, miss, and I got wolves trailing us for the last 2 hours. You can see their tracks getting closer." Through the window, Hazel glimpsed dark shapes moving between distant cottonwoods, four-legged shadows that paced with predatory patience. Her stomach clenched with sudden primitive terror as one of the wolves lifted its head and howled, the sound echoing across the prairie like a funeral dirge that seemed to call others to the hunt. The driver was already unhitching his horses with frantic efficiency, his breath steaming like dragon's fire as he worked. When he swung into the saddle of the lead horse, Hazel finally grasped what was happening. "Wait." She scrambled from the coach, her worn boots breaking through snow crust that came up to her knees. "You cannot abandon me here to die. Can and will miss." His voice carried no malice, only the brutal pragmatism of frontier survival. "Company don't pay me enough to freeze for one passenger, especially one traveling on charity fare. Should have bought a proper ticket if you wanted proper protection." The truth stung worse than the wind. She had scrubbed floors in Boston laundries for 3 months, saving every penny for the cheapest ticket west, eating nothing but bread and thin soup to afford even that passage. "There's an old line camp stable maybe half a mile that direction." He called over his shoulder, pointing toward a dark smudge against the white horizon. "Might keep you breathing till morning if you're quick and lucky." Then he was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow with her last connection to civilization. The silence that followed pressed against her eardrums like physical weight, a complete absence more terrifying than any sound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the prairie itself waited to see whether she would live or die. Behind her, something howled again, much closer this time. Hazel stood beside the abandoned stagecoach and felt panic crawl up her throat like a living thing. She had survived the coffin ships from Ireland, the cholera wards of Boston, grinding poverty that killed dreams before they could take root. But this was different. This was the kind of death that came slowly, stealing warmth and consciousness degree by degree, until a person simply lay down in the snow and never rose again. A wolf's snarl erupted from the brush behind her, followed by the sound of paws breaking through crusted snow. She spun around to see a gray shape emerging from the cottonwood's lips, pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs as reflecting the pale light with predatory hunger. Terror gave her wings. She grabbed her carpet bag and began running through snow that caught at her skirts and filled her boots with ice. Each step was a desperate battle against the cold, already numbing her toes, each breath a conscious act of defiance against the vast indifference of the prairie winter. The wolf behind her gave chase with a howl that was answered by others, a whole pack converging on the scent of fear and exhaustion. Her lungs burned with each frozen breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stumbled forward the stable ahead, seeming to retreat like a cruel mirage. She could hear them gaining ground, their paws finding better purchase on the snow than her clumsy boots. One leapt at her heel's jaws, snapping closed inches from her ankle as she stumbled and nearly fell. Only a desperate lunge forward saved her from those crushing teeth. The stable door loomed before her like salvation itself. She crashed through it just as something large slammed into the wood behind her claws, scraping against the barrier that had just saved her life. The interior smelled of old hay and horse manure, but it was shelter-blessed, wind-free shelter that meant the difference between life and death. She was gasping for breath, still trembling with terror when a voice spoke from the shadows. "Sleep next to me or not at all." The words were quiet, matter-of-fact, spoken in accented English by someone who had learned the language as a second tongue. Hazel's heart, already racing from her desperate flight, hammered even harder as a figure emerged from the darkness, a man tall and broad-shouldered, with long black hair, braided with leather strips and skin bronzed by prairie sun and wind. Lakota, she realized, recognizing the beadwork on his buckskin shirt and the style of his moccasins. A Spencer carbine rifle rested in the crook of his arm like it belonged there, and a jagged scar ran across his ribs, visible through a gap in the leather. His dark eyes studied her with the wariness of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury few could afford on the frontier. Outside, the wolves had begun circling the building, their claws scratching against wood as they searched for weaknesses, their frustrated whines audible through the gaps between boards. "The stagecoach broke down," she managed to say, still catching her breath from her desperate flight. "The driver abandoned me. I heard it happen. Heard him abandon you to save his own skin." The warrior gestured toward the back of the stable where a sturdy Mustang stood, tethered, its intelligent eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through cracks. "Also heard the pack tracking you. They've been following easy prey for hours." As if to confirm his words, claws scraped against the door, accompanied by low growls and the sound of several large bodies moving around the building's perimeter. "You're safe enough from wolves in here," he continued, "but you'll freeze to death before dawn if you try to sleep alone. This building has more gaps than walls, and the temperature's still falling. I can see your breath steaming already. Why should I trust you?" The question escaped before she could stop it, fear stripping away her usual Irish politeness. Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Because if I meant harm, you would already be harmed. Out here, intentions reveal themselves quickly, usually with blood." He pulled a folded coat from his pack and laid it on the straw-covered ground between them. "We share warmth, nothing else. Back-to-back blanket over both. You keep whatever weapons you have. I keep mine." Hazel did not mention that her only weapon was a small sewing knife her mother had given her, hardly adequate for frontier defense, but sharp enough to make a point if necessary. "What is your name?" "Tokala. It means fox in my language." He was already arranging blankets with the efficiency of someone who had spent many cold nights in difficult places. "And you are the Irish girl? Everyone in 3 territories has been talking about the one who paid her passage with laundry money and pure determination." "I have a name, Hazel McKenna." "Hazel McKenna," he repeated as if testing the sounds. "And what brings an Irish girl to Dakota territory in the middle of winter with nothing but a carpet bag and fierce pride?" They arranged themselves with the coat as a barrier, his heavy wool blanket pulled over their shoulders. Hazel had never been so close to a man who was not family, could smell the leather and wood smoke in his clothes, feel the solid warmth of his back against hers. The heat he radiated was like a small furnace driving away the deadly cold that had been seeping into her bones. "My mother died of fever in Boston," she said, quietly surprised by her own willingness to share personal information with a stranger. "Before she passed, she made me promise to go west. Said I would find something better than the tenements and factory work that killed her spirit long before the sickness took her body." "And have you found something better?" Hazel considered the question as wind howled through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the wild scent of snow and predators. "I found you warning me about freezing to death, which is more kindness than I received from the stagecoach driver who abandoned me here. The kindness has nothing to do with it," Tokala replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Dead people make poor traveling companions, and I may need someone who can speak English without suspicion when I reach Willow Springs." "What brings you there?" "The kind of business that might get me shot if I'm not careful." His voice grew serious. "Someone has been raiding farms and supply wagons, leaving Lakota arrows behind, to make it look like my people are breaking the treaty. I'm tracking the real culprits." Outside, the scratching at the door grew more insistent. Something large bumped against the walls, testing for weaknesses. Through gaps in the boards, Hazel could see moving shadows and the occasional glint of reflecting eyes. "Are they?" she asked carefully. "Breaking the treaty, I mean." "No." The word carried absolute certainty. "I know every warrior in Chief Wikasa's band and every warrior in the 3 neighboring bands. None of them would risk war over a few cattle or bags of flour. But someone wants white settlers to think we would." A new sound made them both freeze, the crunch of boots in snow, moving with deliberate stealth around the building's perimeter. The wolves fell silent, immediately retreating from whatever human presence had appeared in the darkness. Tokala rose like smoke, moving to a crack between the boards, where pale moonlight filtered through. Hazel held her breath as shadows passed by the gap, human shapes, definitely male, carrying what looked like rifles. "The 3 of them." Tokala whispered, his rifle already in his hands. Faces darkened with grease, but the patterns are wrong for authentic war paint. These are white men trying to look like Lakota warriors. One of the shadows stopped at the door. The latch lifted slowly, metal scraping against wood with the careful movements of someone testing an entrance. Through the crack, Hazel could see the silhouette of a man's hat and the bulk of a heavy winter coat. Tokala sighted through the gap, waiting with the patience of a hunter who understood that the first shot often determined who lived and who died. The door shook as someone pushed against it, testing the resistance. "Probably just drifters taking shelter," one voice said quietly. "Still best to make sure they don't see anything they shouldn't." The Spencer carbine cracked like thunder in the confined space, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding in the darkness. Through the ringing in her ears, Hazel heard cursing and the rapid thud of boots as the intruders retreated toward their horses. "Damn it, that Indian's armed better than we thought," one voice called. "We'll get him in the morning when we can see to shoot straight." The sound of galloping horses faded quickly into the wind, leaving behind only the wolves who had returned to their patient vigil around the building. "They won't return tonight," Tokala said, lowering his weapon. "But they saw you on that stagecoach, which means someone knows you're here. Tomorrow will bring questions you may not want to answer." "What did those men want?" "To silence witnesses to their masquerade. You saw them trying to look like Lakota raiders, which means you can testify that their attacks are fraudulent. That makes you dangerous to whoever is orchestrating this deception." Hazel pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, processing the implications. "You think someone is deliberately trying to start a war between settlers and the Lakota? I know someone is. The question is who benefits from such a war and how far they're willing to go to provoke one." Tokala's voice carried old anger carefully controlled. I used to scout for the Army a few years back. Saw how some officers and contractors grew wealthy selling supplies for campaigns against dangerous Indians. Started wondering if some of those campaigns were truly necessary or just profitable. They shared coffee at dawn, heated on a shovel over a small fire built from broken boards. The wolves had departed with the darkness, leaving only tracks around the manure pile as evidence of their nocturnal vigil. Tokala studied the hoofprints left by the three riders, reading details in the frozen ground that were invisible to Hazel's untrained eyes. Well-shod horses, grain-fed rather than grass-fed. He noted crouching beside the clearest impressions. And look here, a distinctive mark burned into this saddle impression. Double V brand overlapping. That belongs to someone with money and permanent operations. The morning air was crystalline and still with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered prairies sparkle like a field of diamonds. Hazel sipped the bitter coffee and felt warmth spread through her chest for the first time since the stagecoach had abandoned her. "You know who uses that brand?" she asked. "Victor Hale. Owns the biggest ranch in the territory plus the dam that supplies water to most of the settlements. Sits on the territorial council, has connections with Army procurement officers, the kind of man who believes his vision of progress justifies any means necessary to achieve it." They shouldered their packs and began the walk to Willow Springs, following wagon ruts that cut through rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods. The conversation came easier now daylight, and shared danger having broken through the initial wariness between strangers. Tokala told her about his time as an Army scout, including his presence at the Battle of Slim Buttes in 1876. Watched soldiers attack a Sioux village with overwhelming force. He said, his voice carefully neutral. Women, children, elders, none were spared. Soldiers seized winter food supplies that families needed to survive, claimed it was military necessity. That sounds barbaric. It was efficient. But I began noticing patterns. Officers who seemed more interested in seizing property than ending conflicts. Contractors who always had exactly the right supplies to sell when new campaigns were being planned. Men who prospered every time the Army had to fight Indians. He paused to help her over a fallen tree that blocked their path, his hand steady and warm as he steadied her footing. Started wondering if some of those battles happened because they were necessary, or because they were profitable. "What made you stop scouting?" Watched a supply train accidentally deliver spoiled beef to a Lakota camp during treaty negotiations. Same contractor who sold that beef made a fortune supplying replacement rations to the Army when the talks broke down and fighting resumed. His jaw tightened with controlled anger. Realized I was helping men get rich off other people's suffering. As they crested a hill, Willow Springs spread below them. Two main streets lined with false-fronted buildings, several cross streets with neat houses, and the silver thread of Willow Creek running through the center. A large ranch house dominated a hill overlooking the settlement, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of considerable wealth. Near Hale's place. Tokala confirmed following her gaze. Built with money from government contracts during the last round of Indian troubles. Some say he also made a fortune selling beef to the Army at prices that would bankrupt honest ranchers. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, a solid building with barred windows and a weathered sign reading Emmett Malone, Sheriff. The man who greeted them was in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of human nature's capacity for cruelty. "Tokala." Malone said, recognition immediate. "Heard you were asking questions around the territory. Hope you found some answers that make sense of this mess." "More than I bargained for." Tokala replied and proceeded to describe the previous night's encounter in detail. Hazel added her observations about the raiders' appearance and equipment, particularly the double V brand she had glimpsed. Malone leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. "Victor Hale uses that brand, that's certain. You are absolutely sure about what you saw, Miss McKenna?" "Clear as daylight in the moonlight," she confirmed. "Well, that presents considerable complications." The sheriff's expression grew grim. Hale wields enormous influence in this territory. Territorial councilman, water rights owner, employer of more men than most towns have residents. Accusing him of staging fake raids is serious business that requires serious evidence. And what kind of evidence? Tokala asked. The kind that stands up in court against expensive lawyers and influential character witnesses. Eyewitness testimony is valuable, but Hale has enough political connections to make life very dangerous for anyone who accuses him without ironclad proof. From the sheriff's office, they walked to the general store where Hazel hoped to find information about employment opportunities. The proprietor, a nervous man named Davies, with shaking hands and darting eyes, seemed reluctant to discuss much of anything. Not much work this time of year. He mumbled, avoiding her gaze, while pretending to organize already organized shelves. Most folks can barely feed their own families. You might try the school teacher, though. Ruth Carter sometimes needs help with paperwork. Ruth Carter proved to be a woman in her early 30s, with brown hair pinned back severely, and the kind of practical dress worn by someone accustomed to hard work. She was sweeping the steps of the one-room schoolhouse when they found her attacking accumulated snow with determined efficiency. "So you're looking for work," she said after Tokala had explained Hazel's circumstances. "Can you actually read and write properly, or just sign your name like most folks who claim education?" "I can read and write in English and a bit of French," Hazel replied. "My mother insisted on proper education before she died." Ruth studied her with measuring eyes, taking in the worn dress, the careful way Hazel spoke, the obvious intelligence behind her green eyes. "The Indian Agency pays me to maintain attendance records for Lakota children who attend school. Paperwork must be copied in triplicate, filed, properly submitted monthly to bureaucrats who probably can't read it themselves." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Fair warning, though. Some people in this town don't appreciate seeing Indian children learning to read and write alongside white children. They think education gives Indians ideas above their natural station." "What kind of ideas?" Hazel asked. "The radical notion that they're as intelligent as anyone else. The dangerous concept that they deserve the same opportunities. The subversive belief that treaties should be honored and promises should be kept." Ruth's voice carried conviction that brooked no argument. But for just an instant, something flickered across her face, a shadow of uncertainty or perhaps guilt that Hazel couldn't quite interpret. "It sounds perfectly reasonable to me," Hazel said. "Reason isn't always popular on the frontier, Miss McKenna, but it's always right." Ruth's voice grew firm again, whatever uncertainty had been there vanishing. "Dr. Pike has a loft available above his office if you need lodging. Clean, dry, private space." Dr. Edwin Pike occupied the ground floor of a neat two-story building with examining rooms, a small surgery, and shelves lined with bottles of medicines and tinctures. He was a man in his mid-40s, with gentle hands and tired eyes, that had witnessed considerable suffering. "Ruth Carter's recommendation carries weight with me," he said after testing Hazel's handwriting and arithmetic skills. "The loft's been empty since my previous assistant moved to Denver last month. Furnished with bed, desk, washstand. You're responsible for your own meals, but there's a good stove." That evening, as Hazel settled into her new lodgings, she reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed. 24 hours earlier, she had been facing death by freezing in an abandoned stagecoach. Now she had shelter employment and the beginnings of what might become a genuine community. Through her single window, she could observe lights flickering on in houses throughout Willow Springs. Families gathering for evening meals, children being summoned from play, the normal rhythms of life, in a place where people intended to stay and build something lasting. But underneath that apparent normalcy, she sensed tensions that ran deeper than the usual frontier challenges of weather and isolation. The way Davies had avoided her eyes when discussing employment, the careful phrasing of Ruth's warnings about local attitudes, that strange moment of uncertainty that had crossed the teacher's face. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Pike stood in the hallway carrying a tray with soup, bread, and coffee that smelled like civilization itself. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on her small table. "Ruth told me about your circumstances. Takes considerable courage to start over in a new place with nothing but determination. Thank you." The soup was thick with vegetables and meat substantial fare that would sustain her through the cold night ahead. "Dr. Pike, may I ask you something?" "Certainly. There seem to be tensions in this town that go beyond the usual frontier challenges. Ruth mentioned opposition to Indian education, but I sense there's more to it." Pike considered the question, carefully studying her face in the lamplight. "You're perceptive, Miss McKenna. Yes, there are deeper problems. Land disputes, water rights, the usual conflicts that arise when different groups try to share the same territory." He paused. "There have been incidents lately. Raids on isolated farms, supply wagons attacked, property stolen or destroyed. Some blame the Lakota, but others aren't convinced. What do you think?" "I think someone is working very hard to keep people frightened and angry at each other. Fear makes individuals do terrible things, Miss McKenna. It also makes them easy to manipulate by anyone clever enough to exploit their worst instincts." As winter progressed into early spring, Hazel settled into the rhythms of frontier life, while keeping her eyes and ears open for information about the mysterious raids. Her work copying records for Ruth Carter brought her into contact with families from both settler and Lakota communities, providing opportunities to observe tensions and gather intelligence. The Lakota children who attended school were bright, eager to learn, and completely normal in their behavior, hardly the savage warriors some residents feared they might become. Their parents, when they came to collect them each afternoon, were polite, concerned about education, and obviously committed to maintaining peaceful relations. But Hazel began noticing small inconsistencies in Ruth's behavior that troubled her. The teacher would sometimes pause in mid-sentence when discussing certain families, as if catching herself before saying too much. She seemed to know details about ranch operations and territorial politics that went beyond what a schoolteacher would normally encounter. Most puzzling of all were the occasional visits from well-dressed men who came to the school after hours. Ruth always claimed they were Indian agency officials, but Hazel noticed they never carried the usual paperwork or identification such officials would possess. They spoke in hushed tones and left quickly, as if conducting business they preferred to keep private. During one of these conversations, which Hazel observed from her window above Dr. Pike's office, she saw Ruth hand over what appeared to be written documents. The exchange was brief but furtive, and the man's reaction suggested the information was both expected and valuable. When she mentioned these observations to Tokala during one of his visits to town, and the Lakota warrior's expression grew thoughtful. "Information is the most valuable commodity on the frontier," he said quietly. "The question is what kind of information Ruth Carter might possess and who would pay well to obtain it." Their investigation took on new urgency in early March when another incident occurred. The Hendricks family farm was attacked during the night their livestock scattered and their barn burned to the ground. Sarah Hendricks claimed she had seen painted warriors fleeing the scene, but her description contained the same inconsistencies that had troubled Hazel about previous witness accounts. More importantly, the attack had occurred on a night when Hazel knew most of the Lakota families had been attending a sacred ceremony at Chief Wikasa's village. A ceremony that Ruth Carter had mentioned in passing during a conversation about scheduling conflicts for school attendance. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had known the Lakota would have perfect alibis for that particular night, yet had staged an attack that would be blamed on them anyway. It suggested a level of inside knowledge that made Hazel's suspicions about Ruth's mysterious visitors take on darker implications. She began paying closer attention to Ruth's behavior, noting patterns that she had previously dismissed as nervous habits. The teacher would often pause when writing reports, as if considering what information to include or exclude. She frequently glanced toward the window during afternoon lessons, as if expecting someone or watching for something. Most telling of all was Ruth's reaction when Hazel mentioned that she had been thinking of visiting Chief Wikasa's village to observe traditional Lakota educational methods. The teacher's face had gone pale, and she had quickly suggested that such a visit might be misunderstood by certain town residents. The breakthrough came in April when Hazel decided to work late at the school to catch up on filing that had accumulated during a recent bout of spring fever among the children. As she organized attendance records by lantern light, she heard familiar voices approaching the building, Ruth's voice and that of a man she had heard during previous late-night visits. Pressing herself against the window, Hazel could see Ruth and a well-dressed stranger standing near the school's back entrance. The man was facing away from her, but his expensive coat and confident posture suggested wealth and authority. "The information you provided about the ceremony proved very useful," the man was saying. "My brother was able to time the Hendricks operation perfectly, knowing the Indians would have perfect alibis." Hazel's blood chilled as the implications hit her. The man had mentioned "my brother" in connection with staging fake raids. If Ruth was providing information to someone whose brother was orchestrating attacks, "I don't want to know about your operations." Ruth replied, her voice strained with obvious distress. "I just want this to end before someone gets killed." "It will end when we have what we came for," the man said coldly. "The territorial governor has agreed to review the treaty boundaries once we can demonstrate that the current arrangement is unstable. A few more incidents should provide sufficient justification. And if I refuse to keep helping, then you'll face the consequences of your previous cooperation. The evidence of your assistance is already documented, Miss Hale. If you're exposed as a spy who betrayed the Indian families, you'll be lucky if they let you leave town alive." Hazel's heart nearly stopped. Miss Hale. Ruth Carter was a Hale connected to Victor Hale, the man Takala suspected of orchestrating the fake raids. But from the conversation, it seemed Ruth was being coerced rather than willingly participating. "Victor promised this would be over by now," Ruth said desperately. "He said a few minor incidents would be enough to convince the government to relocate the tribe peacefully." "Victor's vision has expanded," the other man replied. "The potential profits from proper development of this territory are too great to risk on half measures. We need the Indians completely gone, not just moved to a smaller reservation." As the conversation continued, Hazel learned that Ruth had been providing information about Lakota movements and activities for months, believing she was helping prevent violence by keeping her brother informed. Only gradually had she realized that her intelligence was being used to plan attacks rather than prevent them. Now she was trapped by her previous cooperation, threatened with exposure if she stopped helping, but tormented by guilt over the consequences of the information she had provided. The attack on the Hendricks farm had been possible because Ruth had mentioned the ceremony date, giving the conspirators perfect timing to stage a raid, while the Lakota had unshakable alibis. When the conversation ended and both figures disappeared into the night, Hazel remained at the window, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. Ruth Carter was Victor Hale's sister, coerced into spying on the very community she had grown to care about. The conspiracy was larger and more dangerous than she had imagined, with territorial officials apparently involved in planning to seize Lakota lands through manufactured pretexts. Most importantly, she now understood why Ruth had seemed guilty and conflicted during their previous conversations. The teacher was caught between loyalty to her brother and genuine affection for her students and their families, forced to betray people she cared about while fearing the consequences of refusal. The next morning brought news that confirmed Hazel's worst fears. Word spread through town that another attack was being planned, this time targeting the school itself. According to rumors circulating among Hale's ranch hands, someone had decided that attacking children would provide the ultimate provocation to justify military intervention. Hazel knew she had to act quickly. She found Takala at Dr. Pike's office, where he was receiving treatment for a minor wound sustained during a scouting expedition. When she told him what she had overheard, His expression grew deadly serious. "We need to confront Ruth directly," he said quietly. "If she's being coerced, she might be willing to help us stop this before children get hurt." They found Ruth at the school preparing lessons with hands that shook slightly as she wrote. When they entered, she looked up with an expression that mixed relief and terror, as if she had been expecting this confrontation and dreading it in equal measure. "We know," Hazel said simply. "We know about Victor, about the information you've been providing about what's being planned." Ruth's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. She sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands as tears began flowing freely. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. "I thought I was preventing violence, not causing it. Tell us everything." Takala said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can't help you if we don't understand the full situation." The story that emerged was both tragic and complex. Ruth had indeed been sent to Willow Springs by her brother 3 years earlier, tasked with monitoring Indian activities and reporting anything that might indicate hostile intentions. Victor had convinced her that such intelligence would help prevent misunderstandings and maintain peace between communities. "He showed me newspaper articles about massacres and uprisings." Ruth explained, her voice breaking with emotion. "Said that proper information could prevent such tragedies by helping authorities address problems before they escalated." For the first year, she had dutifully reported on school attendance, family movements, and community activities, believing she was serving a noble purpose. But gradually, she began to realize that her reports were being used not to prevent violence, but to plan it. "The first time I suspected something was wrong was after the Wilson Ranch attack," she continued. "I had mentioned in a report that the Lakota children would be staying home from school for several days due to a traditional coming-of-age ceremony. The attack happened during that ceremony, when the warriors were all accounted for at the village. As the pattern became clear, Ruth had tried to stop providing information only to discover that Victor had been documenting her cooperation all along. He threatened to expose her as a spy if she refused to continue, knowing that such revelation would likely result in her death at the hands of betrayed families. Then he started making demands for specific information, she said. Times when the village would be undefended routes that supply wagons would take schedules for tribal gatherings. I realized he wasn't preventing conflicts, he was orchestrating them. In desperation, she had begun providing false information when possible, but Victor had grown suspicious and started sending his associates to verify her reports. The man Hazel had seen was one of Victor's partners in the conspiracy, tasked with ensuring Ruth's continued cooperation through a combination of threats and surveillance. "What's being planned for the school?" Takala asked urgently. Ruth looked up with haunted eyes. "Tomorrow night, they're going to attack during the evening when parents come to collect children from late study sessions. Victor says killing children will finally provide sufficient justification for the army to remove all Lakota from the territory permanently. We have to stop them," Hazel said fiercely. "How?" Ruth asked desperately. "If I try to warn people directly, Victor will know I betrayed him. He'll expose me as a spy, and even if I survive the community's anger, he'll just postpone the attack until I can't interfere." "Then we don't warn people directly," Takala said thoughtfully. "We set a trap of our own." The plan they developed was both simple and dangerous. Rather than trying to prevent the attack, they would allow it to proceed while ensuring that the attackers were caught in the act with overwhelming evidence of their deception. Ruth would continue playing her role as unwilling informant, providing the conspirators with information that seemed accurate, but actually served their purposes. Most importantly, they would ensure that no children were actually present during the attack, while arranging for witnesses and law enforcement to observe the staged raid from concealment. The goal was to catch Victor Hale and his associates red-handed with proof that would stand up in any court. "It's risky," Takala warned. If something goes wrong, if they suspect a trap, people could die. People will die anyway if we don't stop this. Ruth replied with grim determination. These children have become more important to me than my own safety. I won't let Victor hurt them to satisfy his greed. They spent the rest of the day making careful preparations. Sheriff Malone was briefed on the situation and positioned his limited forces where they could observe without being detected. Dr. Pike agreed to serve as both witness and medical support if violence erupted. Most importantly, the children and their families were quietly warned to stay away from the school the following evening, though they were not told the specific reason for the precaution. As evening approached, tension filled the air like an approaching storm. Hazel positioned herself in her window above Dr. Pike's office, where she could observe the school while remaining hidden. Takala took a position among the cottonwoods behind the building, armed with his Spencer carbine and ready to act if the situation turned deadly. Ruth remained at the school maintaining her normal routine while preparing for the confrontation that would determine whether their plan succeeded or failed catastrophically. The attack came at dusk, just as the last light was fading from the western sky. 6 men approached the schoolhouse with military precision faces, darkened with grease and charcoal, in crude imitation of war paint. They carried torches and weapons, clearly intending to burn the building while making it appear that Lakota warriors were responsible. But as they surrounded the school and began preparing their assault, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows behind them. "Good evening, gentlemen," Victor Hale said with cold satisfaction. "I trust everything is proceeding according to plan." The sight of the territorial councilman personally overseeing the attack provided exactly the evidence they needed to prove the conspiracy went to the highest levels of local government. But it also meant that Victor suspected something was wrong, otherwise he would never have risked personal involvement in such dangerous activities. "Something feels off about this," one of the men muttered. "Too quiet. Where are all the parents who usually come to collect their children?" Ruth assured me there would be a full evening session tonight. Victor replied, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Perhaps the families are simply running late." As if responding to his words, Ruth appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, her face pale but determined. "Victor," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Hazel had ever witnessed. Brother and sister faced each other across the schoolyard, while armed men waited in the shadows, the weight of years of deception and manipulation hanging between them like a physical presence. "I know what you've been doing," Ruth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know about the fake raids, the innocent people you've killed, the war you're trying to start. And I know why you really sent me here." Victor's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. "You were always too sentimental, Ruth. Too concerned with individual feelings to see the larger picture of progress and civilization." "Progress?" Ruth's voice rose with anger. "You call murdering innocent people progress? You call stealing land through deception and violence civilization?" "I call it necessary," Victor replied coldly. "This territory has resources worth millions of dollars, water rights, mineral deposits, grazing land that could support 10 times the current population. But it's being wasted on primitives who don't understand its true potential. Those primitives are my students," Ruth shot back. "They're children who dream of becoming doctors and teachers and farmers. They're families who want nothing more than to live in peace and raise their children safely. They're obstacles to progress," Victor said with chilling finality. "And obstacles must be removed one way or another." As the siblings argued, Hazel could see Takala moving through the shadows, positioning himself for action. Sheriff Malone and his deputies were also closing in, though they remained hidden until the right moment to spring their trap. But Victor was no fool. As the confrontation continued, his eyes kept moving, scanning the darkness for signs of the ambush he suspected was waiting. When he spotted movement among the cottonwoods, his hand moved toward his weapon. "A clever girl," he said to Ruth with grudging admiration. "You almost had me convinced this was a genuine operation. But you've arranged an audience for our little family reunion, haven't you?" Before Ruth could respond, Victor drew his pistol and pointed it directly at her heart. "Come out, whoever you are," he called into the darkness. "Show yourselves, or I'll kill my dear sister right here in front of the schoolhouse she's grown so fond of." The threat was genuine. Hazel could see the cold calculation in Victor's eyes, the willingness to commit any atrocity necessary to achieve his goals. Ruth stood frozen, understanding that her brother truly would murder her without hesitation, if it served his purposes. "You have 10 seconds. Victor continued, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Then Ruth dies, and we proceed with burning the school anyway. The only question is whether we add her body to the evidence of Indian savagery." Tokala emerged from the shadows, first his rifle trained on Victor, but unable to fire without risking Ruth's life. Sheriff Malone and his deputies followed, weapons drawn but equally helpless in the face of the human shield Victor had created. "Excellent," Victor said with satisfaction. "Now we can discuss terms like civilized people." "What terms?" Malone demanded. "Simple ones. You all put down your weapons and walk away, forgetting everything you've seen tonight. In exchange, Ruth lives, and we postpone our plans until a more convenient time." Victor's smile was cold as winter wind. "Or you can try to play heroes and watch my sister die for your noble principles." It was a perfect trap. Any attempt to rescue Ruth would result in her death. But allowing Victor to escape would mean the conspiracy would continue elsewhere, eventually resulting in far more deaths. They needed a solution that would save Ruth while preventing Victor from escaping to commit future atrocities. That solution came from an unexpected source. As the standoff continued, Hazel noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Dr. Pike was approaching the schoolhouse from an angle that would put him behind Victor, moving with the careful stealth of someone who understood the delicate nature of the situation. But Pike wasn't armed, and Victor would surely hear him approaching before he could intervene effectively. The doctor needed a distraction, something that would draw Victor's attention away from his surroundings long enough for Pike to act. Hazel made a decision that would have terrified her a few months earlier, but now seemed like the only reasonable course of action. She opened her window and called out across the schoolyard. "Victor Hale," she shouted, "I have something that belongs to you." Victor's head turned toward her voice, momentarily confused by this new development. "Who are you?" "I'm the Irish girl who witnessed your men staging a fake raid." Hazel replied, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet evening air. "I'm the witness who can testify to what your conspiracy has been doing." "Then you're the one who's been causing all this trouble." Victor said, his attention now fully focused on her window. "Perhaps killing you will be more satisfying than killing my sister." As Victor turned to aim his weapon toward Hazel's position, Dr. Pike struck with surprising speed and precision. The elderly doctor tackled Victor from behind, sending both men tumbling to the ground as the pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. Ruth immediately ran toward the safety of the schoolhouse, while Tokala and the sheriff moved to subdue Victor's companions. But Victor himself was far from finished. He threw Pike off with violent strength, reaching for a backup weapon while scrambling toward the cover of the nearest building. "Kill them all," he screamed at his men. "Burn everything, leave no witnesses." What followed was a brief but intense battle, as the conspirators tried to fight their way out of the trap while law enforcement worked to contain them. Gunfire echoed across the town as residents took cover and waited for the violence to end. Dr. Pike, wounded but determined, managed to reach his medical bag and began treating injured men from both sides, his commitment to healing transcending the politics that had caused the conflict. Ruth huddled in the schoolhouse, safe, but traumatized by the revelation of her brother's true nature. The fight ended when Victor cornered and desperate, made one final attempt to escape by setting fire to the school building itself. If he couldn't have the satisfaction of framing the Lakota for its destruction, he would at least deny his enemies the satisfaction of using it as evidence against him. But as flames began to spread up the schoolhouse walls, Victor made a critical mistake. In his eagerness to destroy evidence, he trapped himself inside the burning building, overcome by smoke, before he could reach an exit. Tokala and Sheriff Malone dragged the unconscious territorial councilman from the flames, but the damage to his lungs proved fatal. Victor Hale died the following morning, taking with him the driving force behind the conspiracy, but leaving behind enough evidence to expose the full scope of his criminal activities. The trials that followed sent shockwaves through Dakota Territory and beyond. The revelation that a territorial councilman had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal treaty-protected Indian lands through staged violence led to comprehensive investigations of similar activities throughout the frontier. Ruth's testimony proved crucial in securing convictions against the surviving conspirators, though her own role as an unwilling informant generated considerable controversy. Some community members viewed her as a hero who had risked everything to stop her brother's crimes, while others saw her as a traitor who had betrayed their trust, regardless of her eventual change of heart. The debate was settled by an unexpected source. Chief Wikasa himself spoke on Ruth's behalf during the trials, explaining that Lakota tradition recognized the concept of redemption through honest acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to making amends. This woman made mistakes, the old chief said in his testimony. But when she understood the true consequences of her actions, she chose to risk her own life to protect our children. That choice demonstrates the kind of character we hope to see in all people, regardless of their background. Dr. Pike, recovering slowly from his injuries, also supported Ruth's continued role as teacher. Education is about helping people grow beyond their mistakes, he said simply. If we don't forgive those who genuinely seek redemption, we become no better than the criminals we condemn. As spring turned to summer life in Willow Springs gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, the exposed conspiracy had actually strengthened relationships between settler and Lakota communities, as people recognized their shared vulnerability to manipulation by those who profited from division and conflict. Ruth threw herself into her teaching responsibilities with renewed dedication, establishing programs that brought together children from different backgrounds to learn about each other's cultures and traditions. Her personal experience with the costs of deception and hatred made her a passionate advocate for understanding and cooperation. Hazel found herself increasingly involved in these efforts, serving as a bridge between communities, while pursuing her own education under Ruth's guidance. The Irish immigrant who had arrived with nothing but determination was becoming a respected voice for justice and reconciliation. Her relationship with Tokala continued to deepen as they worked together on projects that promoted mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence. What had begun as a practical partnership for survival had evolved into something much more profound, a shared commitment to building the kind of community where all people could thrive regardless of their background. One evening in late summer, as they walked together along Willow Creek after another successful day of cross-cultural education programs, Tokala surprised her with an observation that seemed to crystallize everything they had experienced together. That first night, he said, settling beside her on their favorite fallen cottonwood, "When I told you to sleep next to me, or not at all, you looked at me like I was making a threat." Hazel smiled at the memory, though it seemed like a lifetime ago. "I thought you were." I'd never met anyone who spoke so directly about survival necessities. And now I understand it was truth about more than just staying warm. It was about trust, about making difficult choices when everything seems impossible, about recognizing that we're stronger together than we are alone. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had anchored her through so many challenges. "I learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about building something worth surviving for." Tokala took her hand in his calloused fingers, intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become natural over months of shared struggle and triumph. Then let's keep building it together. The wedding that took place the following spring was unlike anything Dakota territory had ever witnessed. Rather than a traditional ceremony from either culture, they created something entirely new, a celebration that honored both backgrounds, while emphasizing their commitment to the integrated community they had helped create. Chief Wicasa performed the Lakota portions of the ceremony, speaking about the sacred nature of partnership and the responsibility of married couples to serve their community. Reverend Matthews, who had overcome his initial prejudices through personal experience with the conspiracy's deceptions, conducted the Christian elements with genuine warmth and respect. Ruth served as Hazel's witness, her presence a powerful symbol of redemption and second chances. Sheriff Malone stood with Tokala, representing the law enforcement community that had helped expose the truth and protect innocent lives. The entire community attended, creating a festival atmosphere that lasted for 3 days and included music, dancing, and food that reflected the diverse cultural heritage of the region's residents. German immigrants contributed traditional breads and sausages. Irish families brought fiddle music and step dancing, while Lakota elders shared ceremonial foods and traditional songs. The most meaningful moment came when Hazel opened her bent tin locket and shared her mother's bread recipe with the assembled guests. Women from all communities worked together to bake dozens of loaves, filling the air with the scent of rye and hope, while children played games that combined traditions from multiple cultures. My mother told me I would build something lasting in America, Hazel said as she addressed the gathered celebrants. I thought she meant a house or a business. Instead, I found something better, a community where people choose cooperation over conflict, where children grow up knowing that different means interesting rather than dangerous. As the celebration continued into the night, the newlyweds slipped away to visit Dr. Pike's grave on the hill overlooking town. The gentle doctor had not survived his injuries, but his sacrifice had made their victory possible, and his memory continued to inspire their work toward a more just and peaceful community. He would have been proud, Tokala said quietly, placing wildflowers on the simple headstone. He helped build what we're celebrating, Hazel replied. His belief in the possibility of healing and redemption made everything else possible. Years passed, and their community became a model that attracted visitors from across the nation. Journalists wrote articles about the Willow Springs experiment. Politicians cited it as proof that diversity could strengthen rather than divide communities, and other frontier settlements attempted to replicate their success. Hazel and Tokala raised 3 children together, Elena, who inherited her mother's intelligence and passion for justice, James, who showed his father's diplomatic skills, and Mary, who displayed early talent for medicine, like Dr. Pike. All 3 grew up fluent in multiple languages, comfortable in different cultural traditions, and committed to the principle that cooperation was stronger than conflict. But their greatest legacy was not their famous community or their accomplished children. It was the simple truth they had proven through daily choices, that people could choose to see each other as family rather than enemies, that survival meant more than just staying alive, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. As Hazel entered her later years, she often reflected on that terrifying night when she had first met Tokala in the abandoned stable. She had been running from wolves, fleeing death by freezing, expecting nothing more than temporary shelter from the storm. Instead, she had found a partner who taught her that the most important survival skill was the courage to trust, to hope, and to work towards something better than what existed. The bent tin locket she still wore contained not just her mother's bread recipe, but symbols of the life they had built together, pressed flowers from their wedding photographs of their children, and a fragment of the treaty that protected the rights of all people to live in peace. And when young people asked her for advice about building their own futures, she always gave them the same wisdom Tokala had offered on that first night. Choose to face challenges together rather than alone. Choose warmth over cold trust, over fear, cooperation over conflict. Choose to build something beautiful that will outlast your own lives. The prairie wind still blew as fierce as ever across Dakota territory. But in Willow Springs, people had learned to shelter each other from its cold embrace, creating warmth that would endure long after the storms had passed.